I'm on last not because Workers' World Party has a bad line on gender, but rather because I was down at 100 Center Street doing jail support for the 58 people who were brutally arrested by the NYPD last night at a mobilization against police brutality in the subway system, and also the really decrepit state of our subway system. So right now, there are still about 22 people in, including Colin and Dee. And so there are scores of people down there now. So earlier this morning, it was not so busy, but now there are lots of people down there. And hopefully they'll be out by the time I'm done giving this talk. So I was supposed to speak on what road to socialism, not which road to socialism, what road to socialism. And as part of this, I thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of give like a moderate report back on the conference that I just attended as part of an IEC delegation to Havana, Cuba a couple of weeks ago. It was a really excellent conference. It was held in Palco, which is the big convention center that they have there. And there were about 1,400 militants from across the world at this one space. And it was just incredibly impressive. I had never been inside of this room before, and to just see all the way up to the rafters, banners and people and chanting, and just, I mean, a really great energy in that room. It was super invigorating. And what I found especially really interesting is that there were so many different types of people there, you know, like on one hand, you had people who are engaged in armed struggle right now, and then you also had more moderate social democrat forces from the Latin America. Of course, we're not talking about the Sanders people here, but, you know, and I was looking at this and I was like, wow, you know, what is it that brings all of these different tendencies under one roof? And of course, the Cubans know how to do that really, really well, but I was thinking to myself, what's the thread, you know, that sort of winds its way through this meeting that we're having, because it just felt really important. It felt extremely historical. It was closed out. We had the honor of Raul Castro closing it out, along with you know, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and also Nicolas Maduro, who just loves to show up every now and then out of the blue and surprise and delight everyone. So I wondered what was the thread that ran through it, and so I studied really closely not only what was being said in the conference, but also the kind of literature that was going out around the conference, and even just the title of the conference. You know, it was an anti-imperialist solidarity meeting for democracy and against neoliberalism. And so I finally figured out, you know, on day 3, the last day, I was like, okay, so it's democracy and neoliberalism. And, you know, Scott was saying some stuff earlier about neoliberalism, but it's a difficult word for us to kind of process, you know, democracy. It's kind of a funny word here for revolutionaries in the belly of the beast. You know, when I was 18 years old, one of the more radicalizing things that I engaged in and over the course of my political development, this was in 2004, and so I'm from the South. I don't know anything about whether or not there's still communists left in the world, and so I thought, well, you know, I hate this guy George W. He's a real pig. He's a criminal monster, and he deserves to be shot into space, which I still think yet. But anyway, so I was going out and I was knocking on doors, and I was trying to get people to register to vote, you know, because that's the way that things are going to change, is as long as we can vote this guy out of office. It's like super important. And so here I am, 18 years old, you know, walking around with my turf sheet on behalf of the Teamsters, who in the South were basically undercover at this point. Like they couldn't, you don't work for a union, you know, but here, take these turf sheets, go sign up people to vote. And so of course I ended up in predominantly black neighborhoods, you know, black and brown neighborhoods, but majority black neighborhoods. And I would knock on the door and I would, you know, give my spiel, my 18-year-old fresh face spiel. And I'm not saying anything about 18-year-olds, I'm saying something about this 18-year-old, right? So my fresh face naivete, and I'm saying, well, yes, I understand that you're standing ankle deep right now in a flooded living room, because this year also there were 10 hurricanes that stretched across the state of Florida, you know. But a great way to bring back, you know, resources into the community is to register to vote, you know. And people would laugh in my face and slam the door. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? I just don't understand this. And so I go on okay, this person does not want to register to vote. All right, fine, I'll move on to the the next house. And I would knock on the door and, again, sort of give the spiel, and someone would very seriously look at me and say, well, I would love to vote, but I am a felon, and so I can't vote because I have a felony on my record. And so I would go from door to door to door, knocking, and then eventually I would sit there and review my turf sheets, and I'm like, damn, there's a lot of black men who can't vote in the state of Florida, right? And then I go home and I crunch the numbers, and I realize that it's 3 out of 8 black men today, even in Florida, cannot vote. And so that was the moment where I sort of let go of this word democracy, because I was like, what the fuck does that mean? Excuse my language at home. But, what does that mean? Like, what kind of sick, twisted idea is this, that you would think that there is such a thing as democracy when all of these people can't vote, and in such a really on-the-nose kind of racist way? I mean, and, nowadays when you look at the election polls, sorry, not the election polls, but the election turnout results, and you see that only 55% of people in the United States who could vote turned out to vote last election. 55%. Like, that's not really kind of, forgive me, like a vote of confidence in the system. And then when you actually crunch the numbers and you realize that, wait a minute, out of all the people who could vote in the United States, only 18% of them actually chose Donald Trump as president. And then you say, well, that's because they ran Hillary Clinton against him, and there's a million different reasons. She wasn't the best person to run. Only 5% of people who were registered to vote actually got Hillary Clinton the nomination. When we're talking about democracy, we're actually talking about increasingly smaller portions of the population making these decisions that end up affecting people all over the world, like Scott was saying, in different places. And then on top of that, you only have 10% of the working population in this country is actually in a union now, which is down from 22% in the 80s. So it's 10%. So everywhere I look, I don't see any democracy, right? And yet here I am at this conference in Havana, and everyone is talking about democracy. So I'm like, geez, that it sits strangely with me, and I'm sure it sits strangely with a lot of y'all too, and maybe you'd have to do some internal political wrestling around the concept if you were in my shoes then. But then I started to think about it, and I was like, what saved Nicolas Maduro this year? We did a great job having solidarity rallies with him, all over the world. People were out marching in the streets, in support of Nicolas Maduro. But what really saved him at the end of the day was that day after day after day in Venezuela, there were millions of people pouring into the streets saying, like, absolutely not, we're not going to do this. And I remember because when, the great Hugo Chavez passed away, Empire was delighted. They were like, well, this guy Maduro, he's not anywhere like Hugo Chavez. Like, he's not as charismatic. He's not a military guy. He doesn't have this experience. He's just a bus driver, like he's just a tall, kind of awkward bus driver. And of course, like, he has come a really long way in terms of, his speaking style since he was elected, which is great. He should, but he's really great now. But that's really what kind of saved him, were all of these people coming out. And I thought to myself, were they coming out because they love this guy? Were they coming out because Nicolas Maduro gives an entertaining speech, or like a powerful speech, or moves hearts and minds? Maybe that's part of it. Did they come out because they really hate the U.S. empire machine? Yeah, that's probably a piece of it too. But I think at the end of the day, what really turned people out into the streets was a feeling of ownership, right? And forgive the terminology that I'm using here, but like a feeling of like, this is something that I helped build, that at every single level in Venezuela, there were these councils, there were these, workers' councils and neighborhood councils and school councils and student groups and everything in the military. And people sat down and they put their heads together, and they had a constituent assembly of people who were not only from these different workers' councils or social groups, but people who were disabled, people who were indigenous, people from the LGBTQ community. They really wanted to hear everybody's piece in order to build towards this new kind of constitution. And so that actually makes it more bulletproof than anything else. The fact that everyone kind of had a hand, felt like, yes, I have a serious stake in this. And because I was also thinking about it in context of the new Cuban constitution, which was passed recently. I think it was earlier this year. And I thought to myself, why would they take this time, like right after Fidel Castro passes away, and then Raul Raul Castro steps down, and then there's this new person who wasn't in Moncada, he wasn't in, the Sierra Maestra, he was born after the Cuban Revolution, that one of the first major accomplishments of this government, is that they're going to pass a constitution in much the same way that Venezuela did. It was by going and getting all of this different input from different communities so that people felt like truly and utterly invested in this project that they were all crafting together through these democratic means. So, I mean, again, to forgive the language, it just felt like people had a greater sense of buy-in, that like this was something that they had put their hands to, and so they were willing to go out into the streets and defend it with their lives. Now, I feel like in the United States, there's just still this cynicism of voting. There's this cynicism around the word democracy, and who can blame people? Not just those statistics as I was giving earlier in terms of how many people turn out, but, you look at stuff like the 2008 bailout, for instance. What kind of democratic decision was that? Like, did that ever go up to a vote? Cuomo wants to put 500 new cops in the subway. Did anyone vote on that? People look at it and they say, well, it doesn't matter who I'm going to vote for because the same thing is going to happen anyway. It's always going to be overridden because the system is all powerful. And so it imbues people with this sense of not only like disappointment, but also demoralization. And it can even really demobilize people because they say, well, what's the point? It went bad. Like, what's the point of even bothering to get out there and engage with stuff? And sometimes you can even see this in different groups where people might get involved with something, and then once they see that they have no input in it or that they don't have any buy-in with it, they say, well, I'm going to turn off to organizing altogether because it's just always going to be the same thing. It's this cynicism. And I think a lot about this quote from Karl Marx where he says, the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class are to represent and repress them. Has anyone ever heard that before? And that really, it rings true under bourgeois democracy, that's how it turns out. Now, I even think that this cynicism has infected even the social democratic movement here in the United States around, the social democrats. I think especially there was a DSA rally, or it wasn't a DSA rally, but it was for Bernie, hosted by AOC, so very close to the social democrats, that happened out in Queensboro a couple of weeks ago, earlier this month, where it was basically Bernie Sanders had a heart attack, and so AOC was there to say, no, we're behind him, he's still running for president, vote for this guy. And they got 25,000 people out to this park. 25,000, packed Queensboro Park. People from all over the tri-state area, people from Brooklyn, Staten Island, New Jersey, Westchester, etc. But the one thing is that they hadn't really told the 7,000 NYCHA residents at the Queensboro houses that they were going to be coming there, right? And so then you end up with the April Simpson, who is the Queensboro Houses Tenant Association president, saying that rally wasn't really for us, because how could they not just go and knock on the door? Think about how much more powerful that rally would have been if instead of AOC introducing Bernie Sanders, it was the president of the Queensboro Tenants Association. Like, that would really bring attention to NYCHA housing and, to the situation of the poor and black and brown people and working class poor in New York, bring attention to the train system, et cetera. But that just wasn't done. And I think it's because there is, even from the social democratic perspective, this cynicism about democracy, this cynicism about letting people sort of have a stake in this project that we're building. I think that they see it as, how are we going to seize office power? How is it that we can play this game to make everybody happy enough so that we can get, what was it that Donald Trump got, or sorry, Hillary Clinton, 5% of the voting population to say that we should run for president? We're going to get 6% of the voting, population to say that we should run for president. So I just don't see it as being in any way connected to even almost the social democratic process. And this could actually help explain why groups like the DSA are not in strong solidarity with like the Bolivarian Revolution and with the Cuban people and with what's going on in Bolivia right now. And I do want to mention the fact that both AOC and Tiffany Caban while they are running on these progressive tickets, they also ended up having the largest sectors of who it was that was voting them in were basically gentrifying neighborhoods in the South Bronx and in West Queens, right? So these were the districts that sort of put them in. And you can see it with this disconnect around the Queensboro Houses rally a couple of weeks ago. Now, I think that, when we're talking about what road to socialism, and when we're sitting here listening to the Cubans, and the Cubans are talking about democracy and being against neoliberalism, I feel like it's really incumbent on us as revolutionaries in the belly of the beast to sort of listen deeply to what it is that they were saying. I think that, I really encourage the ideological campaign that we want to do as the party to really get our points out there and realized on paper, but I still think that nowadays most people can pretty much identify what the problem is. Most people can actually say, yeah, capitalism, not going to work out. The planet, falling apart. The police, they can't stop being nasty parasite bullies in my neighborhood. I think people really do understand this. But I guess what we need to do is come up with a plan. And I don't know what the plan is exactly, but I do think that we need to really closely study what this word democracy could mean in the United States and what it could mean in the hands of a revolutionary party. I think that it could unlock possibilities that perhaps we haven't thought of before. What if we were able to explain to people what proletarian democracy means as opposed to bourgeois democracy? What if we could sit there and I know it was an idea on the table, but run two people who are incarcerated for president and say, look, this is the limitations of the system, that people like this can't even run for president, and yet even if you got all the votes in, because the way that the system is set up to disenfranchise Black and brown people who have been locked up in cages, it would expose this contradiction. And by giving people something, to work on otherwise, I think that would be a good idea. I think that sort of orienting ourselves towards a deep understanding of mass work and what it is that we seek to accomplish with this mass work in the coming period, and how it is that we can actually have our class buy into that process of mass work and around proletarian democracy would be absolutely key. Because while our class is in motion, and while there are lots of things that are happening on the streets, people really quickly get, burnt out and disillusioned by decisions that are made in rooms with only, 5 or 6 people, that they don't have open meetings, they're not accountable to people in the community. I think that we can really set a great example by fighting against this tendency and also letting people have that buy-in. I think that the PPA has always been a great institution for this. At the height of the movement here in New York, it was a place where when people were coming in from out of town, they could come and just link in and have, a representative audience that could listen to what it is that they were saying. I think that that's something that is important to encourage and revive. So I'm sorry if I don't have any easy answers, but I do think it is worth considering this idea of proletarian democracy, not just in, a mass way, not just as in, wouldn't it be cool if we could get 1 million New Yorkers to craft a new constitution for the city of New York. Obviously, the city of New York is not going to go through with that, but wouldn't it be cool to engage 1 million people in a process where they're actually trying to build something and let them themselves sort of see the limitations to it, as well as to our own organizing? How is it that we can engage people where they're at and get them more plugged into the process so that when we are facing the rise of fascism, when we are facing these really difficult days ahead, people are going to be willing, with the same willingness, to come out into the streets and defend it with their lives. Thank you. And by democracy earlier, because I think that, and it's totally reasonable that most people in the U.S. hear the word democracy and they just hear white noise. Literally, it's just what do you mean? It's a punchline, it's a joke, and for a lot of people, it's like a bunch of old white dudes in togas, 1,000 years ago, but they'll think about in terms of democracy. But when I'm thinking about democracy, and I think this is, again, sort of a difference between us and people to the right of us who would still say they're left, is that we don't envision a democracy like those old white dudes in togas, and we don't envision a democracy like those old white dudes in Scandinavia. That our democracy is indigenous, right? Our democracy is Black and brown oriented. It is, if you look at the great experiments with democracy over the course of human history, the strongest, most viable examples are not coming from, I don't even know who their names are, these old white dudes in Greece, and it's certainly not dictated by a bunch of slave-owning landlords who came to the U.S. to try and dodge their taxes. So I think that just reclaiming the word democracy in and of itself could be a powerful way forward, not just for the party, but for the movement. And I think that the exciting thing about democracy is that it opens up a whole world of opportunities. And it's part of that organizing structure where it's I think I was saying to someone earlier, it's a different kind of community organizing. I think that, serve the people programs are really important, but at the same time, there isn't the political being built there. There is trust with the community. But what if people were able to organize communities for themselves to be able to meet needs of their communities, or to build power to demand that resources to be able to do that? I think it would be just seen as building something that could long outlive all of us, which I think is a real primary concern. So I just want to say that democracy is not, necessarily going into the booth, and it's not, pulling the lever. It can be a whole different number of things. But I think the most important thing about democracy is that it is something that people feel like they have a voice in, that it is something that people feel like they have a stake in. And I think that in our situations, it is not a one person, one vote kind of system. It is a constituent assembly kind of system where people are able to sit there and strategize based on their own groups what it is that needs to be done, and then be able to bring that to a higher body and so on and so forth. I mean, there are lots of different examples, even, of course, contemporary examples that we could look to for this. So I think the most important thing, and this is something that we can carry with us, not just as like a program and not just as like a pamphlet, but even just in our own organizing, to make sure that that there is nothing more inclusive than the word democracy, that this is a place where everyone has, a stake and a thing that they're building that they couldn't have done under bourgeois democracy. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.